Atlanta, originally founded as the terminus of a major state-sponsored railroad, but soon became the convergence point among several railroads spurring its rapid growth. We're going to examine the official historical account of Atlanta, and we'll find some intriguing anomalies. Anomalies that give indication that perhaps there was a little bit more to Atlanta than meets the eye when we consider the historical account. This is a city that is the capital city of Georgia. Yet, this was not a city that was in existence in the early phase of Georgia. Georgia being one of the original 13 colonies of the United States, being integrated as a state in the 18th century. And yet the rise of Atlanta would not occur until the mid-19th century. It would play a prominent role in the United States Civil War, and then, as many of these other cities that we've looked at, it would grow rapidly upon the conclusion of the Civil War with what we call the Second Industrial Revolution. Let's begin our exploration. Welcome. So we look at a map of Georgia, the state of Georgia in the United States from 1840, and we examine this map because 1840 is when the initial terminus point of this railroad was constructed. Here we have Columbus, Georgia, which is known today for being the home of Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning, major United States military post. When we go up north and northwest, we can see the initial cities. We look at Savannah and then Milledgeville, which was the capital of Georgia. Here is Decatur, a marking city for the current position of Atlanta, and Marietta. You'll see that in this 1840 map, there is no Atlanta, because the terminus was just constructed, or so the official account tells us. However, when we look at the current layout of Georgia, and you can see Columbus there, Noonan, Marietta, and then Decatur, where it is presently. This gives you an idea of where Atlanta would have been as they were founding it in 1840. And this is Fulton County. Fulton County did not exist in 1840, but they carved it out. Now we look at the bird's eye view map of Atlanta from 1871. This is after the Civil War. And we can see that there's really not much to Atlanta. So it makes sense that this would be a new town. And right here you can see the Union Depot, and then next to it the Kimball House, the major hotel at the time. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And this is the City Hall. So not a lot to Atlanta. This does match up, but remember that these bird's eye views are just that, bird's eye views that are drawings. And then we look in 1892, a short 21 years later, and we can see massive growth. In 21 years after the Civil War, there's the Union Depot, there is the second Kimball House, and we've replaced the City Hall with a mighty state capitol, a state capitol that was constructed in under 4 years. And we can see massive development to this city. So an incredible story of rapid expansion with Atlanta from 1871 to 1892. And look at this, we even have a very well-developed park with an incredible obelisk in the middle of it. Atlanta was featured prominently in the Civil War, and it should be noted that during the Civil War, the population was less than 10,000. It was a major target of General William Tecumseh Sherman and the Union because of its terminus point as the railroad. By 1910, the population had grown to 154,000. In these Civil War images, we can see things that don't seem too surprising and match the account that we're given, with railroads being destroyed and the evacuation of Atlanta that occurred with the arrival of the Union Army. However, consider the fact that Atlanta at that time had a population of less than 10,000. It was a major target because of its terminus point in the railroad. And by 1870, there were 21,000 people in Atlanta. So again, it matches the story that there was wanton destruction during the Civil War, over 500,000 Americans died, but then after the Civil War, everyone was all about rapid expansion. Here's the Atlanta City Hall in 1864, and we supposedly have some tents from the Union Army. I guess the Union Army brought chimneys with them everywhere they went. Sherman's mules, they carried their chimneys on their back, and they had to pitch their chimneys as part of their mobile HVAC system. Yes, they had more luxury in the 19th century than modern soldiers do. The destruction photos of Atlanta after the Civil War are well known historically and well documented, including the destruction of the railroads and the many buildings. What's not so well documented is the rapid growth of Atlanta afterwards. Here we see a building that was used by sharpshooters of the Confederate Army, and it was targeted by cannons. Looks like actual cannon destruction, not the nuclear-tipped mortar rounds we expect to see. This is the destruction of Atlanta that Sherman's army brought upon it, and to this day there's a lot of Georgians who have a sore point with William Tecumseh Sherman. And why did the South have to be destroyed in the Civil War? It's a question that comes up in historical debates. We'll see the many different photos of the Civil War. Of course, we'll never have any combat photos. But we do have lots of great photos of posing, to include General William Tecumseh Sherman and his staff here prior to the Battle of Atlanta. I suppose it was just really cool to hang out along a cannon and pose for a great picture. Remember, people were so busy in the 19th century fighting a war that they had to spend more time posing for these pictures. Ah yes, William Tecumseh Sherman. Great profile shot. You even get the idea of how the eyes are very focused. I also appreciate the fact how every officer here in the Union Army seems to get to pick whatever kind of hat that they wanted to wear. That's uniformity for you in the 19th century. I still find it interesting that they're just... What's going on here? What's with this guy and his gray hat? Looks like a lieutenant colonel. And why is he just hanging out in front of the cannon? One of the first things I'll tell you in gun safety or cannon safety is not to sit in front of the muzzle. I guess he just doesn't care. Why does that guy look familiar? There's other photos of destruction in Atlanta, and we'll be told that it was utterly destroyed by Sherman's army, even though the city didn't even exceed 9,000. It's also intriguing that the South managed to formulate its own nation and execute mass mobilization, in other words, uniform an entire army that was conscripted, although accounts on how conscription was used in the South vary. We do know there was conscription in the North during the Civil War. We look at these other photos and we see what's left of the bank here, although we're also told that they got the saloon up and running as soon as the Civil War ended. So perhaps that's how we explain the rapid development and growth of Atlanta after the Civil War. We have more pictures of soldiers just posing, like the way that one guy there was just holding his rifle as though he doesn't have a care in the world. And it looks like they're just having a grand old time. Well, let's take a look at Atlanta through the years, and we'll see rapid development, very large buildings and well-developed blocks, as we saw in the earlier bird's eye view from 1892. We also have the Inman Park homes, where we see something that matches the Plankinton mansion that we looked at in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Very ornate homes and very large at that time. And some of these homes still survive to this day, and some of them have been converted to bed and breakfasts that you can stay at and appreciate all the glories and luxuries that the old world had to offer, namely a place that you could be comfortable in. This is the Empire Building, and this was something from the late 19th, early 20th century, and of course showcasing the finest efforts at the time, that they did indeed have that capability to rapidly build. We also see other images of Atlanta that seem to, once again, cause more questions than they answer. However, what's the difference between a picture and a drawn picture? Can a photograph be changed, or are we looking at something that's legitimately Atlanta? We also have the fact that there are a lot of manufacturing and industries that were associated with Atlanta, and that's what we'll be told was the reason it was targeted during the Civil War, in addition to it being a major rail hub. However, it should be noted that the city had only been around for about 20 years, and yet it already earned itself a target during the Civil War. Quite intriguing when we consider the account. Also intriguing was the fact that they didn't declare Decatur as the city, but, maybe they didn't want to build the terminus of the railroad point in an existing town. And Atlanta has its own version of the Flatiron Building because everybody wanted to be like New York City, except, of course, for Chicago. There's also conflicting accounts on the dating with these photos. You'll even find some accounts that'll say this photo's from 1847, other accounts saying it was after the Civil War. This photo most certainly is from after the Civil War, at least if we go off of the dating with the photos, and you can see why I say that's problematic, as we see the destruction of the old Union Depot and some engines gathered. And here we see a picture of the Georgia State Capitol, and we'll be looking into the account of the Georgia State Capitol. It's quite intriguing as well, especially when we consider the fact that Georgia had a different capital city, Milledgeville, before it was in Atlanta. Look at how well built out this block is. There's something that looks almost otherworldly about this image when we see the trolleys and some of the well-developed buildings, and look at all the incredible masonry construction. We'll be told that people simply worked harder in the 19th century, and perhaps we can believe that, as there's such sayings as idle hands make idle minds. And the last thing you want are idle minds, because idle minds think and ask questions. And that's not really effective to rapidly building a nation, or should we say rapidly founding a city, if you know what I mean. Looking at other images, though, of Atlanta, we can see conflicting accounts with what we're told in the official history. For me, one of the most amazing achievements of Atlanta is how fast it recovered after the Civil War. And not only did they have the Civil War, where Sherman destroyed the city in a fire, or intentionally destroyed it, there was also a great fire in the early 20th century. 1,553 houses and many acres destroyed in this fire in 1917, during World War I. And here you can see it in this panoramic destruction photo. Of course, the chimneys always survive the fire, and the buildings in the background, you can see the state capitol earlier, survived the fire as well. And there they are. So fortunately, it's a fire that didn't go and destroy our new state capitol that we had just built in Georgia, and several of the other large structures in the elaborate and ornate downtown that hard work and people not indulging in idle hands and idle minds managed to achieve. Now, it's intriguing to also consider that other cities all across the United States grew rapidly after the Civil War. Now we'll look at Piedmont Park, home of expositions. And in this sweeping panorama and aerial imagery of Piedmont Park, you can see exactly where it lays in Atlanta to this day. And yet there's still indications that there's a lot more going on in this park. The park was originally home to the Cotton States Exposition of 1895. Yes, another exposition or World's Fair. And they had one in 1895 in Atlanta. There's some intriguing accounts when we look at this World's Fair. Here's the initial layout from it. And it's also something to ponder when we consider all the other World's Fairs that were going on at the same time. I guess the 1890s was the time for World's Fairs. Because you weren't busy enough rapidly building your cities in 20 years after the Civil War, you needed to have World's Fairs. By golly, if it wasn't challenging enough in the 19th century, we needed to make it more challenging. And this one is no exception when we see all the incredible temporary buildings that they managed to erect in a very short amount of time. And we can believe it because it took them 20 years or less to completely build a city. So why couldn't they do a World's Fair, such as the United States government building here at the Atlanta Exposition? Of course, a temporary building, I'm sure, with a beautiful cupola and towers and other elaborate details of architecture that we've come to expect. And we also see that some of these images paint a different picture of some of these buildings. Regardless, we'll be told that they were all temporary buildings, and I'm sure none of them remain in Piedmont Park to this day. Look at that bell tower, and there you see the typical forum look that we've come to expect in all these older buildings with the columns. Let's take a closer look at that building. It looks very interesting. Yes, more detailed and decorative ornation because we just had all the time in the world to include putting up lion statues on a building that was temporary. I'm sure once again it's made of balsa wood. It was also famous for a speech given by Booker T. Washington, which set up the perception of Atlanta being a more progressive city, although it was very controversial at the time, as it promoted racial relations in what was called the New South. Other images of this World's Fair or the Atlanta Exposition show that there were many other incredible buildings that were built in a short amount of time. And it was apparently well known, which I find interesting because this was only a year, 2 short years after the Chicago World's Fair. So I guess you just couldn't slam enough World's Fairs on top of each other in the 1890s. Very incredible with all these statues being put on top of columns. And this was done for a temporary effort. What is really going on here, especially with this World's Fair? Well, I think we know where our theories come from on this. And look at the dome on that building right there. And of course, I remember assessing the flags and what direction they're actually blowing, although it looks like they're blowing the same direction. So a World's Fair that was set up in a short amount of time after Atlanta was built in a very short amount of time after the Civil War, and all in Piedmont Park, which we call Exposition Park. This is the Woman's Building, and we can see that this certainly matches and exceeds many of the other buildings that were already looked at with the dome and the columns. And I even enjoy the little stairway up there allowing access, and here's a picture of it. So again, another temporary building that they decided to build windows in the ground, because you need to have all that. Windows in the ground, columns, and a dome, and many portal windows, with statues on top of that as well. They also had the Piedmont Exposition earlier in 1887. So consider that. Not only did they rapidly build Atlanta in 20 short years after the Civil War, and keep in mind when this exposition occurred, it had only been 22 years from the end of the Civil War, and Atlanta was in ruins from Sherman's assault. Yet it didn't stop them from erecting these incredible structures that were, of course, temporary. And even to this day in Piedmont Park, you'll find some interesting landmarks, such as this little obelisk. There's always a lot of mystery along with some of the inspiration that you have when you walk through Piedmont Park, such as this bridge and this little gazebo that's held up by these columns. I recall walking on this many times, and even before I had the eyes that I do now, I was impressed by the construction on this bridge. And here we have a picture of Grover Cleveland, President of the United States, moseying around during the Piedmont Exposition of the 1880s. So 2 expositions in one single park. And here is just a random scene from Piedmont Park. So how many of these buildings were left standing after these expositions, and what kind of stories do we have to them to this day? Well, I'd suggest if you have the means to explore Piedmont Park yourself, because there's a lot of intriguing questions with it that linger to this day, even looking at this entryway. There's just so much mystery that comes along with the existence of the park itself and the fact that there were 2 expositions held at it. And you just get the hint that there was much more going on at this park than meets the eye, and it's one of the telling points of Atlanta in addition to its official historical account. Well, let's look at the Georgia State Capitol. Franklin Burnham, who had no relation to Daniel Burnham. And as we continue the exploration, you probably figured out that I'm a bit of a sucker for state capitals. Here's the laying of the cornerstone of the state capitol in Atlanta for Georgia. Interesting that it looks like there's already several cornerstones already laid, and this is the only construction photo I could find of the state capitol. So you lay a cornerstone and voila, you have a completed state capitol in under 4 years, which includes the time that it took to have the competition to decide which design they were going to select. And naturally, they selected an architect from Chicago, who just happened to have the same last name as Daniel Burnham, the famed architect from the Chicago World's Fair, but we're told had no relation. It should also be noted that Franklin Burnham eventually went out to the West Coast and designed buildings in Pasadena. I'm not making it up. Once again, we see the usual stylings that we've come to expect in our state capitals: pediment and columns and a gold dome, no less. And it should be noted that the time of construction of under 4 years, it seems as though they'd managed to perfect the process of construction when it came to these state capitals. Iowa took over 15 years to build their 5-dome state capitol. Connecticut took almost a decade. But here in Georgia, they could do it for you in under 4 years. And one of the reasons we're given is because they reused bricks from the city hall, which happened to occupy the exact same location that the state capitol currently occupies. Because why not? I always believe that the interior photos give you a better idea, though, of some of the architectural achievements of the past, and that's why they need to be included. Especially with the stairway, the columns, and the pillars, and all the decorations that they bothered to put on top of them. And let's not forget the floor. Now, many people say that it was easy for them to build these state capitals in the 19th century because people worked harder. Of course they did. Idle hands make idle minds, right? And if you have an idle mind, that's a very terrible thing, especially in the 19th century. Interesting enough, looking up in the dome of the Georgia State Capitol, it's not as well decorated as other domes, but that's because it seems they put an incredible statue on top of the Georgia State Capitol. And why not? Now, what is a statue? Is this the statue of Lady Columbia, the Statue of Freedom, the Statue of Germania, or some other random figure that it seemed was a deity in the 19th and early 20th century? And I know it has an official name for it, but what do you think it is in the comments? What's it really represent? And here we see where the officials always meet, and of course you need to have pediments over your doors and many different columns and an incredible chandelier on a ceiling to conduct the political process. This is an earlier state capitol in Georgia, in Milledgeville, and this is now part of Georgia Military College. So a very interesting progression with this building, and also the fact that there was a different state capital in Georgia, but it's an older state, so it makes perfect sense. This is the governor's mansion in Milledgeville, and, have your pediment and your columns as well. You wonder if this could have been a state capital too. Apparently, Milledgeville was subjected to burning, as many other towns were in Georgia during the Civil War, this one in 1864. Interesting little smokestack chimney going on there. Of course, it's not a picture, it's a rendering. Back to Atlanta, they did have an equitable building, and it reminds me of an equitable building I've seen in other cities. It also reminds me of a structure I saw in Wellington, New Zealand. Well, this didn't survive the urban renewal of the 1970s, because this is what they replaced it with. Ah, the beauty of glass and steel. And that's a building I could see wanting to go to work every day. And if you do work in that building, I don't wish you ill will. I just wish you success. Here is a rendering of the City Hall, and we saw that earlier in our photos of Atlanta during the Civil War, where we had the Union Army camped out in front of it with their mobile chimneys that they carried around on their back. It's since been replaced. There's been a couple different city halls in Atlanta, and this is the current City Hall. We looked at this during a live stream. Wondrous Art Deco building from the 1930s. We'll be looking at the surviving buildings in Atlanta in a subsequent exploration. And here's the customs house / post office that served as the City Hall for a while. And you can see why this would be a very worthy City Hall building. I really enjoy the fact that they always have those windows that are right in there by the ground. I guess that's an essential architectural styling of the time. Many different chimneys and very elaborate decorations above each of the windows that no doubt serve the functions of government. We do have a construction photo of this customs house and city hall, and you can make of that construction photo as you will. What exactly is going on here with all these scaffoldings that we have? Well, now we're going to take a look at the Fulton County Prison, and recall that Fulton County did not originally exist. It was a county that they carved out once Atlanta began its rapid growth. Interesting tower that they have on it, and what exactly is the purpose behind this tower? Is that so they can have the prisoners walk up to the top of it and down for exercise? I was told that the tower on the fire station in Milwaukee was so they could hang out the hoses. Well, maybe they were renting out the tower so they could hang out the hoses to the fire department. Unfortunately, this prison did not survive the urban renewal of the 1950s, and it was torn down. We're also told that the tower was not stable. So they always have some kind of account of that, don't they? The Fulton County Courthouse, 1881 to 1911, a 30-year special. Why exactly would you build a courthouse like this to only last for 30 years? I mean, that wouldn't even be enough time to pay off the 30-year housing loan on it. Oddly enough, some people in architectural circles will say it's because Second Empire style just fell out of favor, and that's why they built these buildings so quickly and then neglected them and tore them down so quickly, of course. Here's the current Fulton County Courthouse, built in 1911, and we can see that this matches architectural stylings we'd expect from the 20s and 30s, with the columns integrated as part of the wall. Very large. This building was designed by A. Tennick Brown from New York, the South's version of E. Townsend Mix. When you needed a large, elaborate building design and completed, you called the Tennick. Yes, he is the South's version of E. Townsend Mix. We have to have one of these people. A. Tennick Brown. Now, he was from New York and educated in the East, much as E. Townsend Mix was, and that's how you explain all these similar architectural stylings across the South, just like you explain them across the Midwest. Very modest obituary, though, for this very famous architect who's responsible for many of the most extravagant edifices in the South, which survive to this day, much as E. Townsend Mix, but I'm sure there's a reason for that. Examining the columns in the Fulton County Courthouse, we can see that they extend for at least 4 stories, if not more. Very impressive, and of course we have our usual stylings of pediments above each of the windows. And you can understand why they would need to build such an elaborate courthouse like this, because this is exactly how you impose in people's minds that they are facing the true authority of justice. And even the pillars have decorations on them. The interior is no less elaborate, and I can just imagine all the court hearings that they had in this courthouse in the early 20th century, all the decisions based on justice. And you can see the interior here, and the entryway is no less ornate, with pediments above the doors and an arched ceiling. I'm kind of recalling what our good friend Brian Dunham said about decisions in justice in the United States. He seems to have this conspiracy theory that they're based on having financial resources to get a favorable outcome. What exactly is this? Is this marble? I need to explore this in person. And now we go to the Peachtree Arcade, 1918 and 1964. Another A. Tennick Brown special. You can see his name there in the lower right corner. I thought that the only shopping arcade that we had in the United States was in Cleveland, but it seems I was wrong. They had one in Atlanta, Georgia as well. And we can see it's even laid out in the same manner as the arcade that still exists to this day in Cleveland. This is considered one of the earliest indoor shopping malls in the United States and in Atlanta. And what exactly is the purpose behind these subsequent balconies on top of each other? And then you look at the floor and it looks like we've got a fountain down there. Yet, looking above in the ceiling, we see the same skylights that we see in these arcades. So does that perhaps hint to a different purpose to this building? Or is it just our imaginations? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I wonder if we'll come across more of these intriguing arcades as we continue our explorations of cities across the United States. This one is certainly a worthy successor of earlier arcades that we had, although when we look at what earlier arcades were, we're told that they were just gathering areas from the quote-unquote medieval times. Well, now to the Hebrew Orphans Home, 1876 to 1930, and once again we have another elaborate tall tower. And what exactly is that tall tower for? Is that so the orphans can get their exercise running to the top of it and back to the bottom of it? A very interesting structure, and quite a tragedy that it's not still with us, because this is just not a way that we build anymore to this day. And I'm just asking that question, why not? I mean, I can't really explain how this would functionally serve the presence of orphans, but I can certainly lament the fact that we don't seem to bother to build like this anymore. And now on to the Atlanta Terminal Station, 1905 to 1972. And of course you have the finest ornate details in your terminal station with two very well decorated towers. Kind of reminds me of looking back over on the West Coast when we looked at Hearst Castle. But of course I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Many different archways on the entryway, and you can see why this would be a very worthy terminal station. Now, supposedly this was for internal transportation requirements within Atlanta, using the trolleys and the train as well. And I suppose it's a reference to the original statement that Atlanta started as the terminal point of the original railroad that they were building to the Midwest. Which is interesting in and of itself because, you've got some very challenging terrain for railroads once you get northwest of Atlanta. You might be familiar with some of the mountains up there. Looking at the structure, though, you can already see that it looks as though they're modifying the towers, and it seems clear that they had an intention to pull the towers down. And the reason we're given is because the towers weren't safe. Yes, it's always the same reason. The towers weren't safe, so they had to bring them down and reduce them to this more modest construction. Yet you can see that on the ground level, many of the ornate decorative details survived. And we'll take a closer look at the entryway here in a moment. But I'm lamenting the loss of the towers. And looking at the grand entryway, you can see some of the brickwork and all the decorations that you need to designate it as a proper train station. It's a terminal. Look at the decorations there above those pillars. And you'll see that it looks to be a lot of brickwork. But I'm always faced with the question, why and how did they devote this kind of effort? Was this all really just for the consideration of idle hands, idle minds? Was it all about avoiding that? These are the interior photos of the terminal station, and this was from 1972 after it had been neglected and they'd planned to destroy it, as they did in that decade. And yet you can still get an idea of how incredible it must have been on the inside, and we consider what we've seen in other Union stations that we've looked at in other explorations. Well, unfortunately, it didn't survive the urban renewal craze of the 1970s, and they tore it down. And one of the other questions I always have with these buildings is how challenging was it for them to tear this down? Well, we do have a photo of them having to do torch cutting to bring it down. So it's very clear that this building was obviously fireproof and tornado-proof, as Georgia does get struck by tornadoes from time to time as well. Here you can see the layout of the terminal station before they tore it down, along with the Union Station, which they tore down as well. We looked at the Union Depot earlier in both the 1871 and 1892 bird's eye views of Atlanta. And here you can see a not the greatest aerial photo showing the layout of the terminal station and the Union Depot. It should be noted, though, that that layout of Atlanta persists to this day. And here's the original Union Depot from the United States Civil War, and this was one of the main objectives of Sherman's invasion of Georgia and ultimately Atlanta, which was to destroy this depot. And here's the wreckage of it after Sherman's army had moved through. A lot of incredible brickwork, though. And it looks like those are very well-developed bricks. And where did they make all these bricks? This is the second Union Station that they built to replace it during the big boom in Atlanta after the Civil War, once many people descended on the city and they managed to build a whole city where none had existed before. Very interesting architecture in this photo, and the Union Station off to the right with an interesting pattern into the shelter there. Seems as though they were just able to really do whatever they wanted to. Well, they tore down that second Union Station and replaced it with this third one, and you can see our finest 1930s architectural designs there. Unfortunately, this Union Station wouldn't survive the urban renewal craze of the 1970s either, but as you can see, when it existed, it had the pediment and the columns and looked like it matched any of the other great Union stations across the nation. Well, they had to tear that down as well. Isn't it interesting that they tore down the rest of it, but left the pediment and the columns standing at the end of it when they tore it down? It just gives you the indication that there's always a lot more going on than meets the eye. Let's take a look at Georgia Tech, founded in 1885. We're going to be doing an exploration on universities across the United States because there always seems to be an interesting story. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that Georgia Tech wasn't already in existence in the 1850s or 1860s. I guess Atlanta had to grow a little bit more before they considered it worthy of such an academic institution. Here you see the academic building and shops and textiles. Intriguing photos. And why not have a Carnegie Library that you throw up there as part of Georgia Tech too? 1885, you're not going to have a real university without a library that's built into a hill with the same interesting, questionable architecture that we see. What exactly is going on here? Now, this looks to be a rendering or a drawing. Very strange photo here, and it looks as though the clock face is missing in the tower on the left, or something's missing out of it, I'm not sure. Well, here's the photo. So is this to give us the idea that they just hadn't put in the clock face yet, or they had some other design idea for it? Very interesting photos of the incipience of Georgia Tech. And what looks to be a dormitory over there to the left, and we have columns on it, along with the tower off to the right. And once again, we see a lack of activity, although we'll be told that's due to the limitations in photography at the time. Well, let's move on to the Kimball House. This one was burned in a fire. The Kimball House was the major hotel for the Union Depot at the time, and we saw it in the 1871 bird's eye view of Atlanta. Well, after that one burned in a fire, they replaced it with this one, and this one was stated to be built fireproof. Yet in every single photo I look at of this second Kimball House that was built right next to the Union Depot, this building looks like it's been around for 1,000 to 5,000 years. Very interesting architecture, interesting corner tower, and many details, especially above each of the windows on the top floor. And then, of course, a little dome, because as if it's not ornate enough. There's a lot of enigma with this particular building. And unfortunately, this is a building that, while it may have been built to be fireproof, and it may have been tornado-proof, it was not urban renewal-proof, and it did not survive the 1950s, as they tore it down. Look, this is prime real estate, and you've got a need for many parking ramps in Atlanta in the 1950s. Well, let's take a look at the Atlanta Fox Theater, and this is part of the Fox Theaters that were built across the United States in 1928 to 1929. Now, we'll be told this was not a concerted effort. These theaters all just happen to look alike in cities across the United States. This one in Atlanta was part of a shrine, or part of a Shriner complex, and you can see the rest of it that's built in the back of the theater. This theater provides a lot of questions, though. And we can see this early 1930s era photo, if that's indeed when the photo was taken. And we can see it may not appear that elaborate or ornate. However, we'll take a closer look at what that theater looks like today. And here we start to get a better idea of how it's evolved, supposedly. And we have more questions than answers as we consider the interior architecture. But let's take a look at the theater itself. And here in the entryway, you can start to see it with some of the columns and again, some of the design detailings and the motifs above each of the doors and the doors themselves. And what exactly is the floor made out of? Well, when you look in the actual theater itself, you are just completely blown away by what you see with all the details. All of these columns and the ceiling. I like that sun motif up there in the ceiling as well. And then looking up on front on the stage, it's as though they were just able to do whatever they wanted in the late 1920s. And we'll be told it's because people worked harder and people had the mentality, idle hands, idle minds. And looking a little bit closer at that ceiling, how exactly did they do that? And how were they able to do it in such a short amount of time, as we're told each of these theaters were built? And even in some of the subsidiary rooms, you can see that they didn't spare any architectural stylings within this theater. And of course, the official explanation here is it was part of a shrine complex, of course. Even the entryway with the columns and what looks to almost be an organ motif above the main doors. Very intriguing. Well, what do you think this building is? Let me know in the comments. There's also a Fox Theater in St. Louis, and I didn't cover it as part of the St. Louis exploration because I was already being completely blown away by all the buildings in that immediate vicinity, and I thought it fitting to include all the Fox Theaters in one exploration. So you'll see that the interior of the one in St. Louis looks a lot like the one in Atlanta. And remember, this was not a concerted effort to build these theaters across the nation, although maybe we'll be told in the subsequent narrative or account that they were. But you can see the same stylings in this Fox Theater in St. Louis with the columns and the ceiling and just unreal decorative detail that they had the ability to put into these buildings. Look at these columns and the arches. Even the base of each of the columns is very well decorated, and just the coloring is something that is not easy to explain. Well, you've got one in St. Louis and Atlanta, you need to have one in Oakland. So East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast. And we see the one here in Oakland, California, next door to San Francisco, has the same stylings that we saw with the other Fox Theaters. Now, the exterior, perhaps you could make an argument that there's some minor variations. But as always, the real story is in the interior of these buildings. And here's the interior of the one in Oakland. And we can see that It has almost like a flower or star motif going on in the ceiling there. And then even in the ceiling on the first floor, there's incredible detail. And here in the lobby, you can see it as well. It's just as though they didn't have enough time to occupy themselves, and they could do exactly whatever they wanted. Look at those pillars over there. And then even on the stage itself, with all the incredible details and architectural trimmings along with art. That seems to be something that we've lost the ability to do, if we did ever indeed have the ability to do that, is mix the incredible durability of architecture with artistic decoration. And of course, there's an easy explanation for it. It's because people got lazy. That's always the explanation. Well, let's look at the underground in Atlanta. The underground in Atlanta is a very interesting consideration because it's something that gives the inclination that there's much more going on in Atlanta than meets the eye. Now, the incipience of the underground in Atlanta comes from this original depot customs house train station. They've got many different functions for it. It looks a lot like the original City Hall, and this is what it originally looked like, but it was subsequently cut down to look more like this, to a single floor. How exactly did they achieve that? I'm not sure. Well, originally it was this part of the train origin, or the terminal station in Atlanta, that explains the construction of the underground. And here's what it looks like now. It's a shopping center that's underground. It's in the title. However, it goes back to the very beginning of Atlanta. And look at what they're walking on there with that brickwork. And really the best way to showcase this would be for me to go and do an on-site exploration. And I have that planned for a subsequent exploration of Atlanta because, frankly, the only way to do justice to the underground and to really showcase it is to walk through it and show how you actually enter it and how extensive it really is. These photos give a little bit of a hint towards the underground, but what's really going on here? This goes all the way back to the beginning of Atlanta, from when it was just a terminus of a railroad. There wasn't even a town there. And yet you have this kind of infrastructure, you have this sort of structure that endures to this day as an underground. It is very intriguing, and it gives the inclination that there's a lot more to Atlanta than meets the eye. That we're really looking on the remnants of the old world. And whatever endured here structurally was turned into a shopping center. Look at that column right there. And then some of the masonry construction here. And then you have these lights down there as well. So this is definitely tabbed for a follow-up exploration. They have this plan to want to modernize it a little bit and make it appear more quote-unquote cosmopolitan. And I wonder if that's going to be at the expense of the original appearance of it. Well, last but not least, Stone Mountain. And you can see Stone Mountain from the skyline of Atlanta, or if you're staying in any of the high-rises there. It's a very interesting feature. We'll, of course, be told that it's a natural terrain feature. Of course, I wonder about that, and wonder about the veracity of if it's a natural feature or if it's a remnant of some pre-existing structure. It could go both ways on it. Yet when you look at closer photos, and if you've actually walked on the top of it, you'll be told that it's just simply the remnants of some intrusive rock. Yet there's something very strange about this terrain feature, as we'll call it, when you look at it from a distance. So I'm not exactly sure what to make of it, but for some reason it gives me hints of looking at Devil's Tower over in Wyoming. And they have the very controversial relief that was supposedly constructed by the same guy who did Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. And to this day, as this is a monument to great leaders of the Confederate States in the South, it continues to draw controversy and ideas that it should be destroyed. But I'm not wondering if there's more we should be considering with this overall rock face of Stone Mountain. I wonder, what would a scientist tell us about Stone Mountain? Oh no. So you thought that I had gone away. Well, look, Carl, you know, your last appearance on the show was very controversial on UFO, and there was a lot of backlash. Listen, I am one of the greatest scientists of all time. I thought you were just one of the greatest scientists of our ages. Silence. Listen, I am here to tell you exactly what Stone Mountain really is. And as one of the greatest scientists of all time. I can tell you that you believing that Stone Mountain is not a natural formation is merely a psychological elaboration in your mind. You have this human desire to look around and see things where things don't exist. This is why we have photographs of Mars, and people believe that there was life in Cydonia. It's merely their imaginations. By the way, did you know that my action figure has actually outsold many other action figures, including in the science fiction franchises? My action figure has actually outsold the Captain Picard action figure.
No! It is wrong. It is wrong! A lifetime of discipline washed away.
Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.